Hello and welcome to this Maritime London webinar in partnership with Lloyd's Register, exploring the case for sustainable ship recycling. I'm Jos Standerwick, Chief Executive of Maritime London, and I'll be moderating today's session. While the conversation in shipping is currently dominated by the technological, regulatory and commercial challenges inherent to successfully decarbonising the sector, it's my contention at least that we cannot talk on building new green tonnage without considering the whole life cycle of the vessel and how the industry is going to manage the requirement to sustainably recycle vessels in a commercially viable manner. This webinar is particularly apposite as while the Hong Kong Convention is yet to meet all ratification criteria to enter into force, as of January 1st, 2021, ships will be required to hold an inventory on hazardous materials, compliant with EU ship recycling regulation. And of course, for EU flagged vessels, this regional regulation is already impacting on ship owners' recycling decisions. During this hour-long webinar, we will do our very best to cover the current market and its emerging trends, the regulatory and compliance framework, whether the commercial imperative for sustainable and transparent shipbreaking practices are superseding the regulatory environment, and how yards and owners are responding to the enhanced demands for increased transparency. And I think then we'll move on to a discussion with all of the panelists we have with us today, exploring how the shipbreaking industry will evolve in the context of the requirement for the industry to decarbonise, and I suppose the various choke points that may exist. To guide us through today's webinar, I think we've put together a truly world-class panel. Udi Barlev, who is Global Manager Ship Inspection and Assessment at Lloyd's Register. Jennifer Riley James, who's joined us while she's on leave at the moment, so much appreciation to her. Senior Ship Recycling Specialist at Lloyd's Register. Martin Crawford Brunt, who of course is known to many of us on this call, Chief Executive of RightShip. James Turner, QC at Quadrant Chambers, who I think it's fair to say sort of shipping hobby is ship recycling, so I think we're all looking forward to hearing his views today. And last but certainly not least, Jamie Dazelle, who's Senior Trader at GMS, who's joining us from Singapore today. Before we get started, I think it's worth providing a quick run through of housekeeping notices as per usual. We certainly don't expect any tech issues, and we have the full might of the Lloyd's Register technical backup team supporting us today. But if we do have any interruptions, please do bear with us. We'll always do our best to minimise background noise, but apologies for any pet, children, cat, whatever they may be, related interruptions. And lastly, but importantly, you will be able to ask questions through the question function. And I'll do my very best to weave in as many of the questions that get asked during the panel discussion. I think that's it from me for now, and I will pass the baton over to Jamie, who will provide a top-level overview of the current shipbreaking market. Jamie, thanks very much, and over to you.
Okay, thank you for tuning in. Just a little bit about GMS. It was founded in Cumberland, USA in 1992. And we now have 9 locations, major locations across the world in China, Germany, Greece, India, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, the UAE, which is the HQ, and the USA. So chiefly what we do is we are involved in the buying and selling of ships. For ship recycling, we've successfully negotiated in excess of 4,000 ships for recycling, with about 1,000 on an as-is, where-is basis. We're also involved in ship owning and trading, and we have managed, traded and sold more than 40 vessels in the bulker, tanker, container and offshore sector. So GMS has become a name synonymous with a sort of leadership of cash buying. We are the largest cash buyer in the world for ship recycling, regularly negotiating around 200 to 300 ships per year. And that's about 30% of all the volumes that go for ship recycling globally. We also have a pioneering green ship recycling program and an award-winning program, which is called the Sustainable Ship and Offshore Recycling Program, the SSORP. So if we go to the next slide, this will give a little overview of where we are in terms of HKC, which is that we have about 120 operational yards in India, and 86 of those yards now HKC certified with the various classes, so Class NK, RENA, IR class, and Lloyd's Register. So that means that a total of about 72% of yards in Alang are currently HKC certified. We also have one yard in Bangladesh and several others that are in the process of trying to upgrade their facilities to HKC standards. Interestingly, also, we had 5 of these yards audited by the European Union Ship Recycling Commission, and 20 actually applied also to get onto that EU list. But I think James will cover this a little bit more in the next presentation. None of these yards have been approved, and they are not likely to be approved anytime soon. So in terms of EU yards in Alang, that is very much out. If we look at the next slide, I've got a few pictures coming just to show you that, like, the scene on the ground in Alang, how yards have upgraded their facilities and how they look at the moment. So you can see that basically all of these yards now have concrete cutting surfaces, and this avoids the permeation of waste into the environment. This is the first picture here. In the next slide I have, you will see cranes removing parts of the steel of the ship as they arrive for beaching, and then those steel plates are placed on the concrete cutting surfaces to safely cut them there. My next slide, these are just pictures of yards in Alang. It will show the intertidal zone where ships arrive before cutting begins. And then on my next slide, you will see the separate hazardous waste storage and handling facilities. This is where asbestos and the hazardous wastes are stored. The GMB, which is the Gujarat Maritime Control Board, then collects these wastes for the responsible disposal from each facility. My next slide will show oily water and stormwater collection systems. And the washing down of those items. And then finally, in terms of pictures, we'll show you how many, the workers now have adequate PPE, proper gloves, boots, hard helmets, jumpsuits, for the cutting process. So that's a brief overview of HKC yards in Alang and how far that they've upgraded their facilities. We're going to cover a little bit more about EU, I think, in the next presentation, which is James. Finally, my last slide will just sort of summarize and tell you a bit about what we do. I've been with GMS since 2009 and have done over 500 deals for recycling. Been based in Dubai, Shanghai, and now Singapore. And yep, that pretty much sums it all up.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks for that sort of top-level overview. I think you've certainly, introduced a number of subjects that we can bring up in the discussion later. And now, no small task here for James. He's going to sort of give us a quick canter through the regulatory and compliance landscape in and around ship recycling. And without any further ado, James, I'll pass the baton over to you.
Thanks very much, Jos. I now have roughly 6 minutes to summarize a topic that usually takes me 60. So here goes. In the shipping world, all the talk is about the Hong Kong Convention, but as has already been mentioned, it's not yet in force and there's no sign that it will be anytime soon. We've also heard already talk of facilities being Hong Kong Convention compliant, and so they may be, but compliance with a convention that is not yet in force may have little legal significance. That matters because, of course, there is another convention, that is in force and has been for nearly 30 years, which is the Basel Convention on Cross-Border Movement of Waste. It has 188 parties at the last count to the Hong Kong Convention's current 15. And there are a few points to note about the Basel Convention. It applies to ships. It applies to ships as soon as there is an intention to recycle, and at that point the ship becomes waste within the meaning of the convention. The convention prevents the cross-border movement of waste, and thus of ships, for recycling, unless all the following consent: the state of origin, so that's where the ship is when it becomes waste, the state of destination, where it will be recycled, and any transit states. And even if they all consent, Basel prohibits the transfer of waste to or from non-parties, which notably includes the United States of America, and also prohibits the transfer of waste from OECD and EU countries to non-OECD and EU countries. That's the so-called ban amendment, which has been in force for, well, a year next Saturday. The Basel Convention also requires Basel equivalents for other conventions, and its Conference of Parties, or the COP for short, has not yet approved the Hong Kong Convention. I don't have time to go into the reasons for that, but the long and short of it is that as matters stand, even if Hong Kong ever comes into force, ship owners will still have to comply with Basel. Now, Basel is not blind to ship recycling, and as long ago as 2003, published lengthy and detailed technical guidelines on the topic. And although those are mostly concerned with recycling yards, they do also cover the preparation of the all-important inventory of hazardous materials. The Hong Kong regime is very different to Basel. It adopts a cradle-to-grave approach so far as ships are concerned, and time, unfortunately, is too short to explore that very far, but I just ask you to note the following. The first is that the inventory of hazardous materials plays a central role. Once the convention is in force, new ships will have to be delivered with one, existing ships will have to acquire one in the course of their classification cycle, and no ship will be allowed to be recycled without one. The convention provides for the certification of the inventory of hazardous materials, of recycling facilities, of what's called the ship recycling plan, which is for the recycling of a particular ship by a particular facility, certification of the ship as ready for recycling, and certification of the completion of recycling. And certification responsibility is split between the flag state, which is responsible for ship-related certification, and the home state of the recycling facility for certifying the facility. Now, the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee has developed several sets of Hong Kong Convention guidelines covering the inventory of hazardous materials, ship inspections, survey and certification, the ship recycling plan, and authorization of facilities. Within the EU, Basel is implemented by the Waste Shipments Regulation, and Hong Kong is implemented by the Ship Recycling Regulation. Both are in force, and the points to note are these. Firstly, with one exception, the two regulations are mutually exclusive. Where the Ship Recycling Regulation applies, the Waste Shipments Regulation does not. And again, with the same exception, the Ship Recycling Regulation applies only to EU-flagged tonnage. The one exception is the inventory of hazardous materials. From the end of this month, as Jos has already pointed out, all ships in EU ports have to have one and can be detained by port state control if they don't. EU flagships, wherever they are, can only be recycled at approved facilities on the EU list. And the most recent list was published on the 11th of November. Now, the capacity of EU list facilities is woefully inadequate and would be even if they were devoted only to ship recycling and did not also recycle decommissioned oil and gas infrastructure or do ordinary dry dock things like ship repair. The position in the United Kingdom, because after all we are going to cease to be within the EU ambit at the end of this month, is as follows. Currently we track the EU, after Brexit, 2 out of the 3 UK facilities that are currently on the EU list will fall off it, unless and until they are reapproved by the Commission. The remaining facility is Harland and Wolff in Northern Ireland, which will go on being treated as if it were in the EU. The EU regulations will be replaced by UK ones, substantially mirroring their terms, but only applying to UK flagged tonnage. And there will therefore be a UK list of approved recycling facilities, but as far as I can tell, no such list has yet been published by Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State. So that's my whistle-stop tour, Jos. Thank you.
James, thank you for that. And you know, I think it's always interesting to take a view of, I suppose, not only the ambiguities that exist within the legislation around shipbreaking, but also its restrictions and difficulties when it comes to compliance. And I think that leads quite nicely on to Martin. And you know, RightShip as an organisation, Martin, I suppose its raison d'etre, if you like, is consolidating the enhanced interests of cargo interests to improve the safety and environmental sustainability of the industry. And in that context, Martin, I mean, do you feel, given the complexity and the restrictions of the regulatory landscape, the commercial imperatives are beginning to supersede that?
Thank you, Josh. I think, you know, we've just had, you know, sort of a great sort of summary of the complexity of the legal requirements. But I think, if I may, I just want to step a little bit out of recycling and just into what's happening in society and the world in general, where we see there's a growing trend for transparency, there's a growing trend for data and information. And certainly one of RightShip's role is to make this information available to all stakeholders and all participants in the industry to make the right decisions and the right choices. So, you know, in a sense, showing what good looks like. And I think that's very much a facet of the way the world is moving. And we can see that it has accelerated under COVID, where there's a lot more interest in terms of this and information. So I think if you step outside of recycling and see what's happening in the environmental space, you see that things are moving quicker than the regulations in terms of public opinion, in terms of ESG requirements for corporate and responsible corporate citizens to do the right things. So very much, I think, you know, this has become a facet of good business going forward. And I think it's something that's only going to accelerate, and it's very pleasing to see that companies are paying more attention to the ESG agenda and how this is good for their businesses as well. And, you know, alongside of organizations, you know, like the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, you know, who've got the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative we might get onto a little bit more in a minute. You know, these are fantastic initiatives which really bring that transparency so that you know, recycling is done in a responsible way, in which considers all the aspects of society, not just the commercial aspects themselves, which are clearly important drivers as well. But I think you know, the industry needs to take a far wider view of this.
Yeah, Martin, of course, and I think, you know, we'll, as you said, we'll pick up a lot of this in the discussion, I suppose. But the societal imperative, if you like, for transparency is going to be a key driver when it comes to ship recycling moving forward. And I think, you know, again, we'll pick this up later, but you know, whether currently, as I sort of mentioned in my introduction, I suppose enough attention is being paid to the recycling of the vessel by the charterers and financiers and other stakeholders within the industry is an interesting point to pick up, but I think we'll cover that in the discussion. And for now, I'll sort of pass the baton over to the Lloyd's Register team of Jennifer and Udi. And Jennifer, I think you're going to kick off, and Udi's going to fill in the gaps, so to speak. So Jennifer, I'll pass over to you.
Perfect, thanks, Jos. Yeah, so. I work in LR alongside Udi, and our portfolio of work between myself and Udi covers anything to do with ship recycling and IHM, so assisting ship owners with certification requirements, but also working quite closely with ship recycling facilities to make sure, or to help them become compliant with the recycling legislation that James has been talking about in more detail. And I think, as we've heard, there's quite a complex regulatory framework which is changing and kind of evolving with deadlines coming into force at the moment. And it's quite complex for both ship owners and recyclers to be able to navigate through without the right knowledge and guidance in place to help them. And so LR kind of works alongside ship owners and recycling facilities to help as an independent third party. So at the moment, we're seeing more and more ship owners working towards attaining their IHM certification against both Hong Kong Convention and the EU ship recycling regulation, which is being driven by the impending deadline, as has already been mentioned by Jos, of the 31st of December 2020, which will mean that from that date, any ship calling at an EU port or anchorage, regardless of flag, will have to have an EU ship recycling compliant IHM and certificate or statement of compliance issued on behalf of flag. So there's lots of issues around there that ship owners are having to deal with to meet those requirements. And we could talk for an hour about that, I'm sure, quite easily at the moment, because it's a very hot topic. One of the reasons that this is such a challenge for ship owners is because of the global pandemic that we've seen over the last, well, nearly a year now. I can't believe I'm saying that, but which has made attendance on board ships very difficult, whether that's for compiling a ship owner's IHM in terms of doing sampling, or whether it's to get certification from an RO or flag, and getting those certification surveys completed can be very difficult. So LR is positioned to try and advise and guide ship owners, as I've said. So we've got guidance that's in line with the latest European Commission notice on how ship owners can try and navigate the deadline if they don't anticipate they're going to meet the certification requirements by the end of the year. And from a survey perspective, from an LR survey perspective, where appropriate, we can help ship owners by offering remote IHM surveys. And there's lots of class societies that are also looking down that route to assist their ship owners. From a recycling perspective, I think we're also seeing a great deal of change in the recycling industry, where we're seeing a greater shift towards transparency in practices, both by recyclers and by ship owners in terms of the policies that they have in place for recycling, and in terms of the expectations that are placed on both ship owners and recyclers from organisations like the charterers or financiers to the industry. And there was a series of webinars that were organised earlier this year by the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative, which Martin has just mentioned. And they provided, that series of webinars provided much more detail on the issues around transparency across the industry. So if anybody's interested in them, I think there's a series of summaries available on the SRTI, the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative website, to have a look at. And I'd recommend looking there. But this increasing pressure for transparency is really kind of leading ship owners to approach organisations like LR for these independent third-party advisory services around end-of-life best practices. So we are now well positioned to offer ship owners globally assistance around choosing the right and the best recycling facilities for them, which will be in compliance with legislative standards, or working towards compliance with legislative standards. And also we can work closely with ship owners throughout the recycling process, so not just ahead of recycling, but during the entire recycling process, to make sure that their ship is actually recycled in compliance with either the Hong Kong Convention but with both the Hong Kong Convention and the EU ship recycling regulation. So it's not just ship owners that we work on behalf of, we work for recyclers themselves, again, trying to help them meet the requirements, as I've said, of the Hong Kong Convention and the EU ship recycling regulation. And we're seeing a greater number of recycling facilities now requesting certification against both of those legislative standards. To date, as we've already discussed in the series of introductions, there aren't any recycling facilities outside of the EU, Turkey or the USA that are included on the EU list of ship recycling facilities. And due to the complex nature of the the legislation around ship recycling, so the Basel Convention, the ban amendment, as well as the EU ship recycling regulation, it's not likely for the foreseeable future to change and include certainly the Asian facilities on the list. And as we've discussed, which James has mentioned, there's now capacity issues, real world capacity issues, with a lack of Asian facilities being listed. And so this is the kind of the final point that I really wanted to make around the recycling piece, is that there's lots of certificates that are being provided to recyclers in the industry, showing compliance with Hong Kong Convention and EU ship recycling regulation. So to date, as Jamie mentioned, there are about 86 Hong Kong compliant yards in India, and a growing number, fewer but a growing number of EU ship recycling regulation compliant yards. But a question to pose and to think about is, does a certified industry actually mean that it is fully compliant? And I think an important point to note here is that certification isn't always analogous to compliance. Compliance is only correct on the day that the certificate was actually issued, and the following day something might happen to mean that that the certificate becomes non-compliant through perhaps no fault of any but one person in particular. So really what is key is that to have certification in place, there also needs to be ongoing monitoring of that certification to ensure that compliance is maintained and remains valid for the entire certification period. And so having that on the ground understanding of ship recycling facilities and what's going on in the facility is really important. And I think this is a really good point now where I can hand over to Udi, who can talk in more detail about the kind of the on the ground LRV point of ship recycling facilities, particularly in India, but also elsewhere. So Udi, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. There are no gaps in what you said, so there is not much for me to add, except for the our point of view as Lloyd's Register since the last 2 years is to look at the future, what we can do now to have a better future in not only in Alang but in all facilities that are about to or are doing ship recycling. There is no, as James said, there is no sufficient capacity appear to be within the EU list to cover everything. And in order to avoid ships being laid up somewhere in the world and rotten, getting, you know, everything polluted, we want to look at the facilities themselves where they do it already and try to stop all the casualties, stop people from dying, and stop the environment being in a disastrous stage where beaching, what I am calling normally as a bad beaching, because beaching cannot be forbidden or stopped altogether. We just have to define what is actually bad beaching or good beaching, if at all. So what we do is we go hand in hand with the facilities who are willing to go hand in hand with us. And we are not just making sure they are complying, as Jennifer said, we are also making sure that they continue with the improvement as far as it's possibly can be done. And that's it for me now. So I go back to Jos.
Thanks, Udi, and thanks to all of the presenters. And I think you know, we've laid the groundwork to what I hope will be a really interesting half hour or so of discussion. And I'd just like to pick up firstly a trend which I think's run through all of your presentations, and that's one of capacity. You know, it's all very well to talk on the responsibility of the ship owner to recycle their vessel responsibly, etc., etc. But I mean, as far as I can see, and I'm open to be proved wrong, but if you're the owner of a Capesize plus vessel, then there are very few options open to you as to where you can get that vessel recycled. And I suppose, is there a lack of pragmatism from the regulators, I suppose, which is stopping those yards that have the capacity to recycle, you know, large tonnage from becoming compliant? And is that holding the industry back in some way? And Jamie, maybe I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that, because you know, we've looked at yards in Europe, and I think many of them have, you know, if they're active at all, only have, let's say, capacity for, I don't know, 2,000 to 5,000 LDT ships. And, you know, if you're talking about a Cape-size bulker or plus of 20,000 lightweight, there are only a handful of yards in Turkey that are EU compliant that can take those yards. And many of those yards in Turkey are now absolutely filled up with a lot of the cruise, you know, the cruise ship industry, which has been on its knees due to COVID. You know, those yards are filled up with 20,000 lightweight plus passenger vessels and the like. So basically, if you're a Cape-size bulker owner, similar size, VLCC owner, VLOC owner, and you have a ship to sell, you actually have nowhere to go today in terms of EU compliant yards. And that's where the subcontinent comes in, because they do have the capacity. And as I said in the presentation, you know, 5 of those yards have been audited, but you know, they're not going to receive a certification. So I think the regulators do need to perhaps wise up and recognise that there are yards in the subcontinent that have to take these vessels because they can't go anywhere else.
And just, I suppose, just to build on that point, and in the context of the IHM code, of course, you know, the IHM code compliance is flag agnostic, if you like, and therefore, you know, it's not just a question of the ship owner being prepared and keeping that inventory, but of course the yard to be prepared and be able to dispose of that hazardous waste in an environmentally responsible way. And I suppose this could be one for Jennifer and Udi. I mean, are the yards that Lloyd's Register are looking at, are they in a position to manage that compliance issue in a responsible manner? Jennifer, sorry, I'll direct that one at Jennifer to start off with, and Udi can come in.
Yeah, so certainly the yards that LR works with, we've worked with very closely for a number of years. And when we provide the certification to them, we make sure that it covers all aspects of the regulatory requirements. And one of those aspects covers the ability to handle all of the hazardous materials that are listed in the IHM, and to make sure that ships that they are receiving actually do have an IHM on board, and where IHMs are found lacking or missing, that an IHM is put in place. Udi?
Yes, the main problem we find in entering a new facility to us is normally the culture in that facility, and the education and the training. And we are emphasizing to the facility owners, as long as your people are not trained not to get in harm's way and not to get killed, and at the same time they keep the pollution away from the beach, then we can start somewhere. If you are not investing in that first, we are in the losing party. Another aspect of that is actually the facilities themselves, and there are many places where we went in the facility which has a big certificate or copy of the certificate on the wall of the CEO, and outside there were people doing things, you know, that they are not, you know, either not using the protective gear properly or at all. They are not supplied with. So it's not a matter of compliance alone. It's also a matter of implementing the actual measures that are required. And it's a problem even to maintain consistency throughout the timeline, because sometimes we go into a facility, they start doing things right, they get the certificate from us, and then a few months down the line we find more and more non-conformities and more, and this is why we implemented the quarterly, at the moment it's quarterly inspections or quarterly audits in those facilities. So it's a work in progress, and we are always looking at improvement, as I said. And if a facility has a certificate on the wall, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are doing everything right. It was a point in time they were probably correct and everything was okay, so they were issued a certificate.
Yeah, and I think you know that that question, and we probably haven't got time, but certification versus compliance is a vexing one. But you know, one at least hopes that the statutory regulators, if you like, are taking greater notice to the certification which the class societies and NR is providing, and maybe we could start to move in the right direction and begin to engender change in a sort of joined up manner. But James, I can see that you want to come in there, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jos. The only point I wanted to throw in is that it's not just a matter for the regulators to pay attention to. It's also a matter for states to pay attention to. Just taking 2 steps back, Basel is designed to put an end to, or at least slow right down, the habit of the Western world of dumping their waste in the third world, and that's what it's all about. And it's very heartening to see the slides that Jamie has shown us of compliant yards in the subcontinent. But one of the concerns about the Hong Kong regime is the self-certification. I know it's done by responsible organisations like Lloyd's Register, but when Hong Kong is in force, the local states will be able to certify, and that will not necessarily be Basel compliant. And then there is a risk where you have flags of convenience and states which may look the other way in terms of regulatory compliance of, if not a race to the bottom, at least the lowest common denominator. And that will stick out like a sore thumb when it comes to the application of Basel, because one of the prohibitions, which I didn't mention in my whistle-stop tour of the law, is that if it is apparent to the state of origin that there isn't, for example, proper downstream waste management by the state of destination, then the waste simply can't leave, and it will be against the law for the ship to depart for the recycling facility in question. And this is serious stuff. That just this week, we've heard of a Norwegian ship owner who's been sentenced to 6 months in prison for breach of, for sending his ship for recycling in the subcontinent. So this is a real world importance, and it's not just down to the EU regulators. There's a lot more work to be done by everybody involved.
Martin, would you like to come in on that point?
Yeah, I think very much. You know, while I have complete sympathy for operators and owners that are trying to find, you know, the compliant recycling facilities, particularly for the bigger vessels, I think, you know, there is a point to be made for the carrot and the stick, right? So there is the regulatory part and there's the carrot part, and I think, you know, the carrot part is becoming more and more important in terms of transparency and doing the right thing and being seen to do the right thing. So I think, you know, that you know, through the Sustainable Shipping Initiative and various other mechanisms, you know, that transparency, I think, is supporting, you know, people to do the right thing. Because I think one of the issues here is that, you know, it's good and well to say you should be a good corporate citizen, but I think also it's right to recognize those people that are doing the right thing as well, so that, you know, there is clearly a cost connected to doing this. But you want to be able to show what good looks like and motivate other people to do the same. And I think, you know, that's the carrot end of it, which I think shouldn't be forgotten here.
Martin, I think we've opened up something which we'll explore in more detail in a minute, but there's sort of a trend emerging in the questions, and that is one sort of being pointed at our Lloyd's Register representatives on the call here, and that's I suppose, just to try and encompass a couple of questions in one. After a certificate has been awarded to a yard, how do you ensure that certificate and that compliance is maintained? And I suppose that's a question of having regular inspections. But Jennifer or Udi, perhaps you'd like to cover that question off.
Well, we are in touch with those yards. As you noticed, we didn't approve many yards. There are actually in Alang at the moment 5 of them, with 2 more in the process. The process is very long, and I'm talking months and maybe years in some of them, because they have to actually crop everything they have and renew everything to place the impermeable floors, and on top of this, the concrete and everything, and purchase equipment, and they are willing to do that. After they set up the facilities and the infrastructure, the hardcore, the basic is there. And what I was talking before is that about the training and the culture, and they even build dormitories for their employees to have somewhere to sleep, and not with the dogs in the village nearby. That's what you can still see in Alang. Yes, we issue a certificate on a date, but we follow up and we keep in touch. And by the way, we visit those facilities unannounced sometimes. Even myself, I went last year when it was allowed to fly everywhere, just to say hello and look around. And yes, we know that for audits and planned visits, the yard can go and prepare everything that they know how to do very well. But sometimes we look around and we dig deeper, and we want some objective evidence that they are keeping doing it when we are not there as well. There was also a question about the what's the use of an LR certificate, and in the eyes of the EU, why going there and certify a yard if the EU is not accepting the yards in Alang into the EU list? Well, we look at this in a separate, with a barrier, because the EU list is including yards which are allowed to be entered in the EU list under the ban amendment and the other legal aspects of this. And we are not looking only into that, we are also looking into the future. As I said, in one point in time, and as we were told also by the EU Commission, that they will look into a legal solution for this problem that will allow EU-listed ships, EU-based ships or EU-flagged ships to be recycled outside of the OECD. And they will go where? They will go into the place they can do it. They have the capacity. So what we try to explain to those facility owners, that in the future, I don't know if it will be far future or near future, they will be looked at. And if they do right now, they will be better prepared. So yes, the EU is maybe not monitoring their own yards, by the way. Maybe they will look also in the outside of the EU yards in a better magnifying glass, and they will see that some of the yards in Southeast Asia could be much better than the yards that are already in the EU list. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
Not a great deal, other than to be able to apply to the EU list, a ship recycling facility needs to have somebody working with them to provide the certification as an independent verifier. And so that's the role that LR has taken on, in part to provide that independent verification that supports the application to the EU list by the recycling facilities. That's another reason why LR has worked closely with a handful of yards to help support that. And I think just looking at the question around, what's the issue around using an LR certified, EU certified yard, it really is going to depend on the flag of your ship as to what issues you might come across if you chose to use an LR certified yard that wasn't included in the EU list, because as James mentioned, there's lots of legal ramifications to not following the requirements of the EU ship recycling regulation, which I won't go into full here because I think it's a whole other conversation topic, but it's certainly something to consider when you're making a decision to recycle.
I think it's a really fascinating conflict, I suppose, regarding the ability of a ship owner to be able to recycle his ship against either the state or the overarching regulatory regime's requirements in regards to how to sustainably recycle that ship. And it brings back, and I will pick this up in a minute, it brings back the view of the industry when it comes to driving up standards beyond that regulatory environment space. But Jamie, at GMS, you're dealing with ship owners and you're dealing with yards on a daily basis. Are you seeing a change in attitude from the yards and the ship owners in terms of how they are perceiving recycling their vessels? And I suppose the other point here is, are they cognizant or able to manage the incredibly complex regulatory landscape which they are confronted with at the current time? And are these sort of dominating the conversations that you're having right now?
I mean, absolutely. It wasn't long ago that 2011, 12, I think, when a lot of Japanese ship owners started to come down and approve yards for their own process in Alang. And there were only a handful of yards then, and since it's grown now to 86, which is 73% of all yards have upgraded their facilities. And that's really a sign of how important it is for yards in Alang to upgrade their facilities just to secure tonnage. And many of these owners are now compelled to go because of shareholders, charterers, all these sorts of things, that they are compelled to go for HKC recycling. So we have seen an increase in demand for HKC recycling, and that is leading to the upgrade of facilities in Alang. And also, I think we will start to see Bangladesh. But I wonder if it's also worth mentioning that in terms of Turkey and India, there is still a slight kind of irrational fear of beaching. The landing process in Turkey, where a vessel kind of goes up a slipway, and the beaching process in India, where, as you've seen from the pictures, steel sections of the vessel get removed from the ship and cut on a concrete cutting surface, thereby kind of avoiding the permeating of waste into the environment. Is there that much difference, or are we just kind of focusing too much on beaching as a bad thing? One final point I did want to make is that from next year, there is talk that China might come back into the picture on international flag vessels. I mean, at the moment, it's only on domestic flag vessels, but there is some talk that we might start to see international flag vessels go to China as well. And they have their cutting process is alongside at a pier or a wharf. So, are the EU going to start approving yards in China? Does that increase the capacity? A few different things to think about, I think.
I think all this leads back, and just to bring us back to talking about the sort of economics of this. Of course, owners who are looking to scrap vessels now may have ordered them 20, 25 years ago when the shipbreaking market looked fundamentally different. And of course, I doubt they would have included the enhanced costs of ship recycling in a sustainable way into their sort of business plans, if you like. And in the context of, one assumes we will see in the sort of medium to long term a significant uptick in scrapping due to the imperative for the industry to decarbonize. Is there an ability to be able to do this in a commercially sustainable way as well? I think there's probably the appetite there to do it, but is there the money there to be able to do it? And are ship owners going to be able to afford to manage this change? And Martin, perhaps I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah, so I think it's really pleasing to see that there are a number of new facilities coming on stream that will be able to provide this capability, because obviously, there's a supply, or a supply issue in terms of the number of facilities that can do recycling in a responsible way, or according to best practice. Obviously we've seen a peak of new building at the beginning of the previous decade. So ships are now coming to 20 years, and I think you know, the next 5 years, obviously there's going to become a sort of an acceleration of scrapping. But I think, you know, zooming out a little bit, I think there is also an opportunity here around in all of the initiatives that we see from the steel industry to produce green steel, for instance. You know, and that is all around, you know, trying to reduce the carbon load from the steel production using electric arc furnaces and DRI and bringing more scrap material into their mix to bring down the carbon emissions from the total steel production, because we know that, you know, producing a ton of steel is 1.85 tons of CO2 for the scope 1 and scope 2 before you begin to think about the transport part of it. So I think, you know, that there is also a possibility to join this up, although of course, you know, steel that comes from ships is small in comparison to the total of the global steel production. I think in Europe and in China actually today and in other parts of the world there's a significant interest in green steel production, and scrap from ships could really play a role in that.
I think that green steel and the fact that actually, you know, that could incentivize yards to improve their behavior is a really, and actually, you know, increase the value inherent to ship recycling is a really interesting concept. But, you know, I suppose in a market where we are increasingly looking at how to incentivize new low to zero carbon tonnage, does the panel feel that we are also at some point going to have to accept that there is a potential failure in the market when it comes to the ship recycling of the vessel in an enhanced regulatory space, and will there require a certain level of incentivization or government intervention to facilitate this change in the short to medium term? And James, maybe I'll start with you on that question.
Well, I think it's a very good question, Jos, because of course one's used, or at least in my practice, one's used to talk about the scrap value of a ship. But if you have to recycle your ship within the EU, that's likely to be a negative value. Ship owners will probably have to pay the facilities for the privilege of recycling their vessels, and the scrap value in Turkey will be lower than the scrap value in the subcontinent. And as you were mentioning earlier, that's quite a serious factor when you're modelling the overall cost of your ship over its lifespan. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do agree with you that if we are going to incentivize the current high carbon fleet to recycle itself in advance of 2050, then there's going to have to be a shift at some point in the economics, because otherwise the numbers are simply not going to add up. Of course, the banks have a part to play in that as well, and there are some very welcome initiatives by Western lenders, both in the context of carbon emissions and in the Poseidon Principles, but also with ship recycling. There's a recycling initiative between some lenders. But the center of gravity of ship finance is undoubtedly moving east, where those rules don't yet have the same traction.
And Jamie, again, I suppose most of your deals, you know, are you know, positive for the ship owner currently when they're looking to recycle their vessel. But do you feel that we are heading to a crux point, I suppose, where the costs of being able to recycle a vessel sustainably are going to outweigh the value of the vessel?
I mean, yeah, owners are still profiting from the end. You know, the ship should be treated as an asset at the end of its life, not a liability, and that's kind of how owners, you know, build in the new building value, second-hand value, right down to what it's worth for scrap. But a huge amount of investment has gone into these yards already, from owners as well as cash buyers, you know, to upgrade facilities, and that continues to happen. Yeah, I think the Japanese started it, going down there and approving certain yards, and you know, the JSA injecting funds into Alang, as we have done as well, you know, to upgrade facilities. So that investment will always be there, and it's a case of sort of trying to bring up standard. Most of the yards now in Erlang are HKC, and now it's a case of can we get all of them in the next couple of years HKC certified and up to standard, and then start looking at other areas. Chittagong has one, and we're looking at getting some more up to the standards of India as well.
Jamie, just whilst I've got you here, there is a question. I'm sorry to put you on the spot a little bit on this one, but I wonder if you have the answer. Roughly how many ships are currently awaiting recycling, and how many ships will have been recycled in 2020? And I suppose as a reference point, is this a big year for recycling? And I suppose has the economic downturn incentivized ship owners to scrap vessels, or are we looking at a relatively steady market?
It kind of went. The year so far has gone in peaks and troughs. The first half of the year was characterized by a huge number of container vessels, and then we saw a big uptick on rates in the container sector. So we are seeing basically no containers for recycling now. But what's going to happen is that tankers are going to take their place. We've seen a lot more dry bulk scrapping of late. The offshore sector continues to shed a lot of tonnage. So it's been quite a steady year so far. I think we have bought around 120 so far this year. It's been steady, but it hasn't been as busy perhaps as previous years. I think the record year was 2012, where we did 300 ships and there were well over 1,000 ships sold for recycling. So yeah, volumes are down definitely this year, but there are sectors that will continue to supply tonnage for recycling. I think we're looking at tankers being the next big sector to come.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamie. And just to build on James's point, I suppose the overall narrative that Martin's been speaking on in regards to this. It's great to see that the financiers are particularly the Western lenders are beginning to build in sustainable ship recycling into their loan agreements, etc. I think we're seeing a number of significant players within the industry sign up to the SSI Sustainable Ship Recycling Initiative. Martin, is there, in your view, Martin, is there enough attention being paid to the end of life of the vessel from the financiers, the charterers, etc.? Those people who can facilitate change in the market. Or right now, is there perhaps too much of a fixation in regards to what the next generation of vessel is going to look like and what's going to be propelling it?
I think, coming back to my earlier comments, I think, it's great if we can highlight best practice and try to motivate more people to engage in that and support initiatives like the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative. So I think the short answer is there's always space to get more engagement or more involvement from a broader range of stakeholders in this. But obviously this needs to be coordinated with the capacity that's available. I think has been mentioned in the call here. It is reassuring to see the steel price go up and the scrap values go up. So hopefully that will support the economics of it. But in short, I think there's a general trend and background trend of having a much greater focus on ESG and transparency in our world and in our industry, which I think it bodes well for the direction of this over time.
Yes, I think that's a relatively positive note to end on, and I'm conscious that we are beginning to reach the buffers of our hour. But I suppose really I'd like to invite the panel to just, if you have any sort of closing remarks or thoughts as to the short-term trajectory of the industry and any likely changes that we are going to see, then I would invite you now to sort of to speak and share those. So Jennifer, if you've got any additional points that you would like to cover off.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of summarize from my perspective the discussion that we've had so far, I think that the regulatory framework that everybody is kind of trying to work to me seems to be the top-down driver, and there's not a huge amount more that we're going to see in terms of change in that, although I hope that we will see some resolution around the capacity issues with the EU list that will be resolved from the top down. But what the next big step is going to have to be, and continue to be over the next, certainly the five-year period, is this bottom-up drive from industry itself, whether that's ship owners, recyclers, financiers, organisations like the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative and SSI, to link together to try and push this sort of kind of bottom-up, ground-up change to meet the top-down regulatory drivers. And I think without that on-the-ground movement and change, it won't work as a whole piece. You need the top-down and the bottom-up. So trying to think perhaps optimistically over the next 5 years, it would be nice to hope that within that time frame, the capacity issues we've talked about are going to get resolved. It might be nice to think that the Hong Kong Convention is going to be on the brink of entering into force, if not entered into force in that time frame, and that we will continue to see this step change on the ground up in places like India, which we've already seen that start, but that we'll see that spread further, and that we'll see it spread wider than India itself to other countries like Bangladesh. So that's where I would like to see us in 5 years' time, but we'll have to wait and see.
Jennifer, I think you've summarised this session perfectly. But does anybody else have anything additional to add? And I very much welcome your optimistic note when it comes to the ratification of the HKC. But James, I suppose, do you share that optimism when it comes to the Hong Kong Convention? And I suppose in addition to that, and maybe again to move to Jamie and Martin, not to be dismissive of international regulation in any way, but how important is the HKC in this conversation, or is it the market which is going to facilitate these changes in the long term? So James, I'll start with you and then pass over to the rest of the panel.
Well, as to whether the convention will be ratified, I couldn't begin to tell you. It may be eventually. What is going to be more important, I think, is the accommodation that is reached, which would be very necessary between Basel and Hong Kong, because unless and until it is, then there will be this colossal tension in the middle of the legal recycling environment. But otherwise, I completely agree with everything Martin's been saying about the bottom-up push. Litigation has its own role to play in that. There have been a couple of actions brought against ship owners arising out of recycling incidents, and obviously that's a terrible thing.
Jamie, have you got, or Martin, have you got anything else to go? Martin, you go first.
No, really, I think that transparency is really the key here, I think, to make this work, this bottom-up thing work, to complement the regulatory side of things, because I think the regulatory side is going to be imperfect because of the way it's structured and because of the different global pulls and, and just the whole thing. So I think the one thing that will transform this in the next 5 years is a greater level of transparency over all of this, showing what best practice looks like, to motivate more people to do that. And your right, Ship has a role to play in that as well, in terms of being that, that mirror, because that'll motivate the behavior in the direction that we'd like to see it go.
Jamie, have you got anything further to add to close us out?
I mean, with the EU having initially inspected 5 yards, but then gone back and basically said that the subcon is out because of beaching. If the EU can come back in and approve yards like they had initially intended, perhaps that could move the conversation on a bit as well.
Onodi, anything from you just to finish things off?
Well, I couldn't be more optimistic than I am now. Really, looking back in the previous decade, in the 2000s, where Basel was born, Basel Convention, and then in the current decade we're closing with the introduction of the EU regulations based on the Hong Kong Convention, which was also in this decade. Looking in the next decade, we will see, I want to believe, that the acceleration of the actions in the yards, the bottom up, as you all say, is getting faster and faster, and there is no other choice between us. I think there will be a lot of improvements in the coming 2 to 5 years. We will see more certified yards, and we will see more owners using those facilities. And I believe with the EU blessing at last.
Well, Udi, I knew there was a reason to leave you till last, and it's always nice to finish these things on an optimistic note. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's obviously going to be a really interesting time, and it does feel like that there is a convergence, if you like, of that bottom up and top down approach. And there's no doubt that the industry is paying far greater attention to the end of life of vessels. I do rather wonder, though, if we were to have this conversation again in 5 years' time, the main focus of that conversation would be, okay, well, listen, there is a failure of the market when it comes to sustainably recycling vessels due to its inherent cost, and perhaps, like we are looking to incentivize new tonnage into the market, there should also be a further conversation as to how vessels can be scrapped and the role of incentives in that as well. And I wonder whether we should look to reconvene this panel wherever we may be in a few years' time to pick this up and see where we are. But it's been a fascinating discussion. I hope we've managed to encompass as many of the questions that have been raised in the question panel as we possibly have been able to. We'll have a look through, and if there's ones that we can answer in slow time, we will certainly look to do so. This session has been recorded, and I think it will be being sent out to all of those who attended. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, and my failure for doing so has been noticed, but we've also run this webinar in partnership with the UK Embassy in Athens, and we've got a number of Greek representatives on the call as a consequence of that. So I'd like to thank the UK Embassy in Athens for their support of this webinar. And lastly, obviously, thank all of our panelists for what I think has been a really engaging discussion. I think as I say, we've highlighted the inherent difficulties when it comes to sustainable ship recycling, but also I think highlighted a pathway at least to a more sustainable future. So again, thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Thank you again. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.